The chandeliers above the ballroom of the Metropolitan Grand hung like captured constellations, their faceted crystals scattering light in 1,000 directions. Each reflection danced across silk gowns and polished marble floors, tracing delicate arcs over champagne flutes, diamond cuffs, and faces that had perfected the art of smiling without revealing a single truth. New York's most powerful had gathered for the Davenport Foundation's annual Winter Gala, a night whispered about in advance, photographed in excess, and remembered for its ability to crown or crush reputations. Beneath vaulted ceilings painted in soft gold, a string quartet played a waltz so sweet it seemed to stretch time itself. And at the center of the room, beneath the slow-turning halo of light, Michael Davenport held a young woman in his arms. His hand rested lightly on the small of Sienna Blake's back, as if she were a fragile, exquisite thing, something he could both protect and display. Her champagne-colored gowns shimmered as they moved, each step measured, deliberate, like choreography rehearsed long before the orchestra struck its first note. Sienna tilted her head upward, letting her blonde curls brush his shoulder. The look in her eyes was soft, almost reverent, as though she'd found her way into a story written just for her. The crowd adored them. They always did. Couples in velvet and satin leaned closer to watch them move, a man and a woman framed in perfection, dancing as if the night belonged to them. A ripple of admiration passed through the ballroom, unspoken yet palpable, like the faint scent of jasmine carried on warm air. Michael Davenport, the self-made real estate king of Manhattan, a man whose touch could transform an abandoned building into an empire, was a figure New York adored. His name opened doors, softened headlines, and made the city bend around him. But there was something else lingering beneath the perfume and polished laughter tonight, something neither the music nor the mirrored chandeliers could quite disguise. It began in whispers, a pause too long on Michael's hand as he guided Sienna through a turn, a knowing glance between two society women perched near the bar, a photographer lowering his camera for just a second too long. Even the air in the room seemed to recognize it, that this dance was more than a dance. And yet, the performance continued flawlessly. Michael dipped Sienna with practiced ease, the fabric of her gown flowing like spilled sunlight. She laughed, soft and breathless, a sound designed for admiration. He smiled down at her, not the tired, distant smile that had once belonged to quiet evenings at home, but the easy charm of a man convinced that he would never be caught. Around them, guests sipped, murmured, and watched. High society had long since learned to pretend that their spectacles were simply entertainment, that the cracks beneath the gold leaf were someone else's concern. Near the back of the room, Patricia Lively, a society columnist with an appetite for scandals dressed as love stories, leaned toward a banker's wife. "It's almost poetic," she whispered behind a jeweled fan. "His wife couldn't make it, and now look, she's glowing like the future Mrs. Davenport." The banker's wife did not respond, but her gaze lingered on Michael's left hand, on the wedding band he still wore. The music swelled, the spotlight narrowed, as though conspiring with him to erase what wasn't meant to be seen. Michael twirled Sienna into a final flourish, their faces close enough for a breath to count as a kiss. The room burst into applause. The applause was elegant, restrained, and every bit as fake as the smile plastered across Michael's face. For him, this was the night he had planned. For Sienna, it was a fairy tale. But what neither of them knew, what no one in that glittering room could imagine, was that this dance was not a beginning. It was an omen. The night that began with light would end in silence. Above the grand doors of the ballroom, where the air was a fraction cooler and the music seemed distant, a clock chimed softly. Time did not rush, nor did it hesitate. It simply waited, because some truths are patient. Some storms arrive dressed in velvet. In that moment, under the gaze of New York's elite, Michael Davenport stood at the edge of his own undoing, though he didn't yet feel the wind shifting. And somewhere beyond those doors, the woman he had built an empire with was already on her way. If this story has already pulled you into its quiet storm, the kind where elegance hides betrayal and love becomes a battlefield, don't slip away just yet. Tap the like button if you want to see where this night will lead. Share your thoughts in the comments and follow for the next chapter of this unfolding tale. The night is only beginning, and so is the reckoning. The first sign was not a sound but a sensation, like a silk ribbon drawn slowly across the skin of the room. Conversations thinned. Laughter softened at the edges. A few heads turned for no discernible reason, as if a faint current had shifted beneath the polished marble and the shoes that skimmed it. The orchestra never missed a note, and yet, in some private chamber of perception, the night seemed to inhale and hold that breath. The doors of the Metropolitan Grand were tall enough to make anyone entering appear momentarily mythic, but it was not height that made the woman in the doorway extraordinary. It was stillness. In a hall of motion, waltzing couples, circulating servers, fluttering programs, she stood perfectly composed, as if the room had been waiting for her spine to draw a plumb line through its excess. Amara Brooks wore a gown the color of midnight 3 seconds before dawn. Not glossy, not attention-demanding, simply inevitable. It draped with a quiet intelligence from her shoulders to the floor, the fabric remembering every dignity she had ever claimed. Her grandmother's diamonds lay at her collarbone like a constellation she had inherited rather than purchased, and the light found each facet the way memory finds its way home. She lifted her chin the slightest degree. It was enough. Patricia Lively saw her first. That old predator instinct, the one that could hunt for heartbreak behind a smile, sprang awake and then went silent with a reverence she hadn't felt in years. The camera rose without being told to, but Patricia did not press the shutter. She knew the worth of a fraction of a second, the fragile physics of a moment that defines all the moments before it. Nearby, a cellist bowed through a phrase that had been written to break and then mend a heart. His hand faltered on the string. No one could have blamed him. Amara let her gaze move, unhurried, across the expanse of people that had once been a map of allies and obligations. She recognized foundations she had nurtured, faces she had placed beside power at dinners that changed the city by degrees. Their eyes reflected a flicker of shame and sympathy, and, beneath both, interest. She felt none of it lodge in her. She was porous now to the unimportant. Only the necessary could pass. The necessary waited at the center of the floor. Michael was turned away from the doors, guiding Sienna through an elegant arc. He was the picture of cultivated ease, the world's favorite narrative painted on his mouth. A woman at a nearby table said something soft and admiring. Her companion nodded, grateful to borrow such certainty. On the periphery, 2 board members exchanged a look that tried to be neutral and failed. Amara had not rushed here. In the car, she had watched the city's winter lights separate and converge, and had measured her breath against the slow rhythm of traffic. She had thought about the first property they'd bought together, a brownstone that smelled of old paper and plaster dust, its walls a catalog of former lives. "It needs structure," Michael had said then, eyes alight. "It needs belief," she had answered, and they had offered both. She had also thought of this morning's text, the one from the event director, wishing her a recovery swift enough to be photographed. The nausea had passed hours ago, the understanding later than that. "Too ill to attend," they would say kindly. "Isn't it a shame?" She had looked at her reflection and seen not an absence but a deadline. Now the room made a narrow passage for her, not out of fear, not yet, but out of recognition. There are people who arrive in a place and immediately bend it into a shape that suits them. Amara had never needed to bend anything. She had learned to ask exactly the right question and to wait. Halfway to the dance floor, she paused. She let her palm flatten against the velvet of a chairback to steady nothing but the past. For a beat, the weight of it tried to return. The years of making and mending, the incremental withdrawals of affection disguised as fatigue, the apologies she had drafted and never sent, the coolness that can grow between 2 people like a hallway they never cross. She felt the sorrow come toward her like rain on wind, touched it, and stepped aside. It fell behind her without complaint. Sienna saw her first. It registered in the smallest muscles, the line of her shoulders, the way her hand, mid-flight, forgot which note came next. The room reassembled around that forgetting. Michael followed Sienna's gaze and found what the room had already understood. Inevitability. Upright at the edge of the dance floor, he did not release Sienna's hand. His face arranged itself with the practiced speed of a man who has paid handsomely to have doorways monitored, Photos retouched, stories delayed. For a fraction of a second, the boy she had met in a worn suit appeared beneath the man in the tuxedo, startled and shining and wanting. Then the boy vanished, replaced by calculation. There is a kind of love that survives humiliation because it is built on private language and not public performance. There is another kind that dies not from cruelty, but from the slow erosion of being unseen. Amara knew which love had been hers. She knew it the way a violin knows the key into which it will most willingly sing. She stepped onto the dance floor. The quartet did not stop. They recalibrated, as musicians do when a pianist arrives late and the music must lean to welcome her. Amara moved without hurry, giving the night a chance to correct itself if it dared. It did not. The circle widened around her until it resembled a crown. She remembered, absurdly and exactly, the list she had made once for a panel on entrepreneurship. 10 rules for building something that lasts. Rule 5 had been, know what you will not trade. She had thought she meant equity and time. She had meant herself. The couple stood before her now. The husband whom the city loved, and the woman who had been drafted into a narrative not of her own writing. Sienna's youth, which had seemed like light, now looked like exposure. Michael's mouth opened on the shape of a greeting that could also be an apology if spoken with enough conviction. Amara felt a softness that surprised her. Compassion, not for what they had done, but for how little they understood of cost. A server approached, paralyzed by training and terror, a tray of coupes trembling in his grip. Amara took one glass. The gesture was not theatrical. It was administrative. She needed her hands to do something that was not trembling. The champagne lifted to her mouth with ceremonial calm. She did not drink. Behind her, something like wind moved through the guests, whispers, the unfastening of restraint. Patricia Lively's camera found its focus. ACFO considered the sudden volatility of an investment that was supposed to be reputation-proof. A philanthropist imagined her name beside Amara's on a future board and decided, very quietly, to hunger for it. Amara lowered the glass. "Good evening," she said, and her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room had already leaned in to hear the life it would repeat tomorrow. For a heartbeat, nothing else existed. Not the donations pledged, not the headline the morning editors had prepared, not the years of work that had taught her to calibrate a tone so it could thread a needle from 50 paces. There was only a woman who had entered a ballroom without permission, because permission had never been the point. In the pause that followed, the story changed authors. Before the chandeliers and the photographers and the velvet steps that led to other people's approval, there had been a drafty brownstone on a narrow Harlem street, a house with arthritic pipes and floors that confessed every footfall, a place so earnest in its disrepair that it seemed to beg for a future. On the day they met it, rain slanted across a sky the color of unpolished silver. Michael stood in the doorway with a folded blueprint under his arm, hair damp at the temples, eyes bright with a hunger that knew the difference between demolition and restoration. Amara arrived holding a leather folio and a thermos of coffee strong enough to convince dreams to stay. "I can make the numbers behave," she said, stepping over a puddle that had declared independence from the roof. "I can make the house behave," he answered, and grinned in that unguarded way that later would need guarding. They walked through rooms where the past had set its furniture down and never returned. Amara touched the banister. The wood was nicked and weary, yet it warmed under her palm like an animal deciding to trust. She spoke in measures and margins, in the quiet authority of compound interest and the patience of long plays. Michael spoke in light and lines, in windows widened to accept morning, in brick liberated from layers of paint that had tried to tame it. Somewhere between their sentences, a promise began to take shape, not spoken aloud but already binding. The first winter was obediently cruel. Pipes burst like impatient arguments. A contractor vanished for 2 weeks and returned with apologies and a baby. Neighbors brought over pound cake and stories of who had lived there before and how the corner store had once stayed open until midnight. They worked by day, she at a midtown firm where her reports were praised and her presence politely misnamed. He on sites where sawdust salted his coat and the future arrived in pallets. and by night they returned to the brownstone to keep company with their plans. When the electrician discovered a nest of unsafe wiring and doubled the estimate, Amara recalibrated the spreadsheet and made room. The way a heart makes room when it discovers a new wing of feeling it hadn't known it could afford. Her sister, Nia, visited on a Sunday and stood in the doorway of the gutted kitchen, arms crossed, laughter in her eyes. "You're building a cathedral out of a pile of almost," she said, half teasing, half warning. Amara looked at the blank wall where a window would be. "Almost is only a word for the middle," she answered, and Nia leaned over to kiss her cheek, as if blessing the unreasonable faith two people were practicing. In spring, light entered the house like a forgiven thing. The front parlor learned its dimensions again. The staircase stopped complaining at every footfall. The day they hung the last door, Michael pressed his forehead to the cool wood and exhaled as if he had been underwater since childhood. "We brought it back," he said. Amara, standing behind him, slid her hand into his back pocket and smiled into the small, ordinary intimacy of the gesture. They celebrated with cheap champagne and expensive strawberries, sitting on the floor because the furniture had not yet believed in them. They did not marry because the city told them they looked good together. They married because of how they looked apart, and then changed when the other walked into the room. The ceremony was under a sycamore that had outlived 4 mayors and a scandal. His mother cried the quiet tears of a woman who had taught her son to hammer and hoped he would build something besides a legend. Amara's grandmother fastened the diamond necklace at her throat and whispered, "Shine is not noise, baby. Shine is what remains when the noise goes home." They built Davenport estates like musicians who had discovered they shared a key. She handled the scaffolding of capital and covenant. He moved through buildings as if they were languages he could already speak, but had never been asked to translate. In meetings, Michael was the bright room. Amara was the foundation that convinced the room not to collapse. Together, they turned boarded windows into eyes that could see again, and neighborhoods responded with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, the city's dialect for change. Success arrived first as solvency, then as reputation, then as invitations that pronounced their names correctly, and still managed to be surprised by the second one. Amara learned to walk into certain rooms with a poise that did not hide her edges. She cultivated a smile that could separate ignorance from danger without spilling its contents. There were afternoons when a developer would address Michael as if Amara were the assistant who had wandered into the wrong light. Michael, to his credit then, would turn the conversation back like a waiter refusing to place the plate on the wrong table. Later, in the car, he would rest his hand over hers on the console and say, "I hate that you have to be twice as good just to be seen." And she would say, "I hate it less when you notice." But there were also small frictions, sand that doesn't announce itself until the gear slips. Michael began to travel more, to court money that wanted the city to be shinier than it needed. He learned a different vocabulary, accelerated timelines, public-private partnerships, the kind of efficiency that forgets people live inside the spaces numbers make. Amara kept the ledger clean and the mission clean as well, arguing for affordable units, for local contracts, for schools that would not be called amenities as if children were decorative. Their disagreements were thoughtful, sometimes tender, sometimes heated enough to fog the interior of their beautiful car. They did not yet mistake difference for disloyalty. They believed they were arguing toward the same horizon. The Davenport Foundation was born almost accidentally. Amara tutoring a high school student at the kitchen table, Michael donating lumber to a community center whose roof leaked less afterward. It became a plan when Amara noticed how her hands opened each time the work had a face. She could name the scholarships without checking her notes, could call the entrepreneurs by their first names and remember the pitch decks by their margins. At galas, she spoke with a clarity that made donors feel less generous than invited, into a story where their money would learn how to matter. The night the company went public, they stood together on a balcony above a city pretending to be made of glass. Flashbulbs fractured the air. Michael held her waist and whispered, "We did it." And for a full minute, she allowed the pronoun to be the whole truth. She didn't register the way he loosened his tie, as if freeing his throat from something it had promised, or how he looked out over the crowd with a hunger that had changed recipes. There were shadows later, of course, but in the season when love was still building, their mornings were a liturgy of unremarkable grace. She brewed coffee while he skimmed architectural journals. He kissed the place where her neck met her shoulder as he left for site visits. She sent him spreadsheets annotated with jokes only two people could find funny. On Sundays, they walked through neighborhoods that did not make the cover of magazines and wrote down the names of streets that would one day be spoken with pride again. If strangers mistook Amara for staff when she opened a gate, she added it to the crooked archive of slights she would bend into strength. If Michael bristled and corrected them too sharply, she placed a hand on his sleeve to tell him the anger was seen and safe. Their love was not the kind that howled. It was cabinetry that fit perfectly the first time. It was stage scaffolding coming down to reveal lines truer than the drawing. It was the relief of a door that had swollen in the summer and now, in the cool of evening, moved easily in its frame. Years later, people would talk about empires and betrayals as if those were the only words available. But in the beginning, there had been two people in a rain-slick house, deciding to make something that would outlast weather. In that decision lay everything: faith, foolishness, forgiveness waiting in the wings. And if the future would eventually teach them where foundations weaken, it could not rob the past of its competence. The house they saved still stands on that street, keeping the rain outside, remembering the names of those who asked it to endure. Success didn't arrive with fanfare. It seeped in quietly, like rainwater beneath a door. One day they were still laughing over paint swatches in the brownstones parlor, and the next, Davenport Estates was being discussed at rooftop bars in Midtown and in boardrooms where the city reshaped itself. The company went public that summer, a sunrise that had seemed inevitable after years of building toward it. Amara wore a white silk blouse that day, the one Michael said made her look like she had designed the world herself. He stood behind the podium, his voice steady and rich, and when the stock ticker blinked their company's name, their shared past gleamed like a polished coin. But somewhere inside that brightness, something faint in hairline had begun to form, a crack so subtle it made no sound. At first, it lived in small, passing gestures. Michael started leaving early for impromptu investor lunches, wearing suits a little sharper than before. He took to silencing his phone during dinners, his smile still gentle, but not quite reaching the corners of his eyes. Amara told herself it was the natural consequence of growth. More responsibility, more expectation, less time to breathe. She had always been pragmatic, careful not to confuse change with betrayal. Then came the first absence, a gala for a children's literacy foundation. A cause she had championed before Davenport Estates had a logo, was a night she expected to share with him. Michael had always been there beside her, polished, affable, the man who made donors feel seen. But that night, the chair at her side stayed empty. An urgent board meeting, he'd said, voice apologetic, but already half elsewhere. Amara smiled through the speeches, clinked glasses, and stood in photographs alone. Later at home, she found his cufflinks tossed carelessly on the dresser, a gesture that once would have felt familiar, but now carried a faint echo of distance. These absences began to layer. 1 week became 2, then months of meetings and events she attended alone, making gracious conversation with men who used to glance at Michael when talking about the future. Now they looked at her with a kind of polite uncertainty, as though the architecture of them was no longer guaranteed to hold. Michael began to talk in a different language: acquisitions, international expansions, legacy portfolios, words heavy with ambition, but hollow where warmth once lived. Amara still joined strategy meetings, still caught the drop stitches in the numbers, still made investors believe their money was wrapped in vision. But somewhere beneath the polished wood of their empire, she began to feel the floor shift. The first argument was about nothing, or so she told herself afterward. A Thursday evening, too late for dinner, but too early to sleep. He had come home smelling faintly of expensive whiskey and other people's applause. She was still in the living room, papers spread out like offerings, cost projections for the new Bronx development. "You weren't at the board call," she said softly, as if remarking on the weather. "I know," he answered, loosening his tie. "I sent David in." She paused. David was brilliant but reckless, a man who loved the noise of the city more than its bones. David doesn't understand the timeline. He'll promise things we can't build. Michael shrugged, a gesture too casual to belong to the man she had built things with. Sometimes promises get people to sign the checks. The silence stretched between them, long and fine as spun glass. For years, their partnership had been built on trust. She grounded the dream. He gave it wings. Now, his wings were drifting towards storms she could not chart. But the sharpest edge of the change wasn't in the fights. It was in the quiet. Before, when she walked into a room, Michael's eyes found hers as though she were a fixed point in a shifting universe. Now she could speak a sentence, entire and careful, and watch it drift past him like smoke through an open window. He wasn't cruel. He was distracted. And somehow, that hurt more. She began to keep track, not in ink, but in memory, of the moments when they used to touch without thinking. The soft press of his hand against the small of her back at galas. The kiss just below her ear when she poured morning coffee. The way he leaned toward her when something delighted him. These things didn't stop all at once. They faded, like the way autumn light grows thin before anyone admits summer has gone. One afternoon, she waited for him outside their office tower, the winter sun slipping down behind the skyline. She watched him from a distance as he emerged, flanked by two new investors and the young assistant, Sienna, whose laugh trilled like wind chimes caught on a sharp breeze. Michael looked alive in a way she hadn't seen in months, eyes sparking with that early ambition she'd once fallen in love with. Only now, it wasn't directed at her. Amara stayed where she was. She didn't call his name. She watched the way his hand hovered at Sienna's elbow, not touching, not claiming, but unmistakably familiar. A small, polished crack. Later that night, she found herself alone on the terrace of their penthouse, the city spread below like a promise they had once made together. Her fingers traced the rim of her wine glass. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't go inside. She thought of the brownstone in Harlem, of the house that once smelled of plaster dust and possibility. She remembered the weight of his hand fitting against hers over blueprints. It wasn't that she didn't still love him. It was that the him she loved had started walking further away, step by step, and she wasn't sure if he'd noticed he'd left her behind. The first crack in a foundation never looks dangerous. It's thin, harmless, easy to ignore in the rush of brighter things. But beneath polished floors and chandeliers, cracks learn how to travel. They learn how to whisper through steel and concrete, until one day they are not a line at all, but the shape of something that can no longer be held together. That winter, the crack began to speak, and Amara, who had built her life on knowing how to read the language of structures, was the first to hear it. Rumors never arrive through the front door. They find the smallest window, tilt their bodies sideways, and slip in like a draft no one wants to admit they feel. In January, Manhattan carried itself with the brittle elegance of a dancer holding a pose too long. Snow feathered the avenues, dissolving before it could decide to be real. That was the month the air around Amara began to change temperature without changing form. It started at the Cypress Club, where old money and new confidence shared a bar polished smooth by the weight of stories. Amara hosted a luncheon for the Foundation's mentorship program. 3 young founders, 2 corporate sponsors, a headmistress from a public school in the Bronx who wore determination like a silk scarf. Everyone smiled for the photograph beneath a portrait of a 19th century magnate whose mustache was an argument. Afterward, as coats were being claimed and promises made, Amara felt the first shiver. A woman she recognized, someone's board-appointed wife with a gift for decorative cruelty, leaned in, perfume forward. "So brave of you to come alone," she murmured, as if bravery were the word she meant. Michael's new project must be demanding. She let the syllables rest on the air like a folded note. Before Amara could unfold it, the woman was already turning away, her smile pinning something to a bulletin board only she could see. At the Davenport lobby, the doorman who never forgot a name forgot hers for a heartbeat, long enough for discomfort to cross his face like a cloud. In the elevator, 2 junior brokers argued in whispers about a bid that wouldn't close and a dinner that had run late. "She was there?" one asked. The other glanced up, found Amara, and invented a cough so robust it required a second-floor exit. At night, when the city put on its velvet and pretended to sleep, the Crosby filled with curated ease. Patricia Lively, curator of other people's truths, texted a photo to Amara's phone by accident or design. A dim corner, a table with a bottle of Sancerre, the edge of Michael's sleeve recognizable to a woman who had ironed it. Opposite him, just beyond the frame, the suggestion of hair the color of champagne, pretending to be gold. Patricia followed with a second message before Amara could type a reply. "Delete it if I'm wrong," she wrote. "Keep it if I'm not. Either way, you tell the story first." Amara didn't answer. She placed the phone face down on the table, the way you do when the news is both too early and too late. She stood and walked to the window. Central Park gleamed below, a geometry of dark and light. Skaters drew ovals that looked like the repetition of a vow. She had told herself for weeks that intensity, after an IPO, was a kind of weather pattern. Hard rain, then clearing. But weather had seasons. This felt like climate. Invitations arrived with her name misspelled, as if the error were contagious. Event photographers asked, "Will Mr. Davenport be joining?" with a politeness that made the question feel clinical. In the hallway outside their bedroom, 2 tuxedos waited for tailoring. Only one was ever claimed. Nia came over with soup in a mason jar and a gaze that had never spared a truth. She tucked her feet under her on Amara's sofa and said, "You're wearing worry like a coat inside the house." Amara laughed softly. "Is it that loud?" Nia shook her head. "It's that heavy. You can set it down while I'm here." They ate, and Amara did not set it down, but she let her sister hold one sleeve. At the foundation office, a volunteer coordinator, young, earnest, the kind who wrote thank you emails that made donors feel like discovered planets, asked if the gala seating chart should be updated. "I heard Mr. Davenport was bringing Miss Blake as a courtesy," she said, eyes already apologizing. A courtesy was a bridge built between 2 cliffs with no intention of supporting weight. Amara felt the floor of her stomach tilt and right itself. "No updates," she said evenly. "We seat the work, not the rumors." She began to notice the choreography of avoidance. A partner from a rival firm complimented her proposal twice and her dress once too often. A city councilman introduced her, for the first time, as the foundation's public face, as though her line of sight ended at a camera lens. In conference rooms, when she spoke, pens paused over legal pads. People looked attentive. Then, subtly, they sought Michael with their eyes as if seeking permission to agree. The permission did not arrive because he was not there. And then there was Sienna. Amara had liked her at first, the assistant who laughed at her own typos, who learned the preferences of every guest who crossed their threshold, who absorbed the grammar of their days without announcing herself. If she wore ambition, she wore it neatly, without ostentation. But ambition frays under friction. Sienna's expressions became more practiced, her silences more informative than her speech. She learned to stand half a step closer to doors that opened into influence. She learned how to be found accidentally where Michael was most likely to appear. On a Tuesday that should have belonged to quiet tasks, Amara arrived early to the office and passed Michael's glass-walled conference room. He stood with Sienna, sleeves rolled, blueprints spread like maps of countries they had not yet conquered. Sienna pointed to a corner lot on the Lower East Side, one Amara had argued to preserve for small businesses, still teaching the block its name. Michael nodded with the old hunger she had once adored. He reached for a pen. Sienna reached at the same time. Their hands touched. The moment barely qualified as contact, and yet the room received it like a signature. Amara kept walking. She went to her desk and closed the door and counted backward from 100 in primes, a trick her grandmother had taught her for moments when calm must be manufactured on demand. When the numbers returned her to herself, she opened a folder labeled Queen's Expansion and found, tucked into the sleeve, a receipt from the Crosby. 2 entrees, 1 dessert, a wine she did not drink. It was dated the same evening she had sat on their terrace and convinced the stars to keep her company. That night, she tried a conversation that began without accusation. "Are you happy?" she asked him, the question so naked it felt ceremonial. Michael turned at the mirror, straightening a cufflink. He kissed her forehead lightly, as you might bless a child before a test. "This is what we wanted," he said, voice soft and distant as an echo. Sometimes the cost is time. She wanted to believe him. She wanted cost to be a ledger item that could be paid with sleep and solved with a weekend. Instead, she woke at 3 a.m., hearing a sound that wasn't in the room. It was the sound rumors make when they stop being air and become furniture. The city helped. New York teaches its citizens to metabolize spectacle until spectacle becomes diet. People decided a version of events that pleased their appetites. A podcast host referred to Sienna as the new classic. A donor asked, "How is Michael adjusting to visibility?" As though visibility were a weather system he needed to survive. Patricia sent no more pictures, only headlines drafted but not run, as if to say, choose the voice you'll use when the time comes. Amara chose quiet for the moment. Quiet was not surrender. Quiet was reconnaissance. She adjusted budgets, tightened oversight, created redundancies where trust had once served as architecture. She took meetings Michael missed and delivered answers that landed like blueprints laid flat. She laughed with interns, not because she felt light, but because she knew the difference between morale and mythology. She wore the diamond necklace on a Tuesday without an event, because memory deserved practice. When she walked through their home, she listened for a timbre in the rooms that had not been there before. Houses hear more than they tell. The penthouse, which had once felt like a terrace built onto the sky, learned the rhetoric of closed doors. The hallway acquired a second echo, the aftersound of apologies that would not be offered. One evening, the elevator opened, and Sienna stepped in beside her, startled into a smile that quivered and then held. "Miss Brooks," she said, respectful, almost warm. Amara returned the greeting and noticed, not the dress or perfume, but the caution in Sienna's throat. The way a person breathes when she has convinced herself she is innocent of anything but wanting. For a floor and a half they were equal. Two women in a moving box, both suspended between floors, both conscious of gravity. When the doors parted, Sienna slipped out first. Amara stood for a moment longer, long enough to feel the machine complete its cycle, long enough to hear the cable hum, a reminder that ascent is not flight, merely engineering obeyed. By February, the city thawed and refroze twice. The whispers did not thaw. They crystallized. They learned names and schedules. They perched on the edges of programs at concerts and on the lips of people trained not to be surprised. Amara did not run from them. She let them collect, like frost on the window of a house that remembers winter and intends to survive it. She traced the pattern with her finger and recognized the mathematics beneath. Small vectors pointing toward a single point of proof. When proof finally arrived, she suspected it would not shout. It would knock once and wait. She would open the door, not because she enjoyed endings, but because she respected beginnings too much to counterfeit them. And if anyone had asked her, in those weeks of polite cruelty and curated silence, how she was doing, she might have said, with a gentleness that did not tremble, "I'm listening." The truth did not arrive with a crash. It arrived with friendly hands and practiced softness, wrapped in the kind of voice that asked you to sit, to breathe, to be reasonable. On a Tuesday that smelled faintly of rain and printer ink, Amara placed a folded receipt on the kitchen island, the way a surgeon might lay an X-ray beneath a calibrated light. Behind her, the city hummed its indifferent hymn. Across from her, Michael loosened his tie as if conversation were a collar he intended to unfasten. "I found this in the Queen's file," she said, even, almost tender. "It was the night you said you were at the board dinner." Michael glanced down. The paper was ordinary. Date, time, 2 entrees, 1 dessert, a bottle of Sancerre. He smiled, gentle, apologetic, before the muscles of his face had finished deciding which arrangement would serve him best. "The Crosby?" he said lightly. "That was a prep meeting. David couldn't make it. Sienna came in his place. You know how chaotic these weeks have been." The explanation stood there, polite and plausible, like a guest with good manners. Amara recognized the structure of it, the tidy logic of emergencies that require substitution. She also recognized the aftertaste of something else. "A prep meeting," she repeated. At 10:45, he exhaled, a measured expression of patience. "This is what the work looks like now, Amara. Strange hours, unexpected asks. You told me yourself, Growth doesn't consult our preferences. He reached for her hand as if to enlist it. Don't do this. Don't turn fatigue into a story that hurts us both. The old reflex hovered, her habit of making room, of leaning toward his explanations, the way a tree leans toward light. But the habit seemed suddenly expensive. I am not turning anything, she said, and her voice surprised her with its softness. I am asking what time it is. Michael took the receipt, folded it once, twice, as if reducing its surface might reduce its meaning. He slid it into his pocket, then leaned forward, his palms on the island, his head tilted with intimate condescension. You've been under so much pressure, he murmured. The documentary, the gala, the council hearings. You're carrying too much. It's making you see patterns where there aren't any. There it was, a small, exquisitely crafted revision, the kind that shifts the room a quarter inch to the left and waits to see if you adjust your balance or fall. Amara looked at him. She thought of the brownstone, the winters of pipe and dust and faith, of the countless times she had steadied structures for a living. She knew a hairline crack when she saw it. She also knew how long it could pretend to be nothing. That night, she dreamed she was standing in a house that asked her to whisper while it rearranged its doors. She woke to Michael returning at 2 in the morning, careful as a thief, his steps choreographed to avoid the planks that remembered sound. He slipped into bed with the relieved sigh of a man who has arrived safely at a story he wrote himself. She lay still, eyes open, counting the spaces between his breaths. A few days later, she took her very calm bewilderment to Dr. Ellis, who kept orchids on her windowsill and an hourglass on her desk because patients like to watch time behave. When I ask for clarity, Amara said, I am recast as suspicious. When I present detail, I am told I'm tired. When I'm tired, I am asked to rest. And when I rest, decisions get made in rooms I built. Doctor, my body looks for a place to stand, Amara answered, and then it remembers that it used to be the place. Gaslight is not a bonfire. It is a dimmer switch, adjusted a fraction at a time until noon resembles dusk. It exchanges certainty for undertones, the way a musician can modulate a key so slowly your ear consents to it without noticing it has given permission. Michael did not deny. Denial would have been crude. He repainted. A fresh coat of plausible on surfaces that had only asked for truth. You're so serious lately, he said the week after, his voice pitched between concern and critique. It's not like you. The Amara I fell in love with could let go. She could, Amara answered, folding laundry with clean, defiant precision. She did. And then this happened. He laughed softly. This? A dinner? One dinner? Is this what we've become? Auditors of each other's calories? When she didn't smile, he added gentler, come on, you're too smart for jealousy. She looked up. Jealousy is wanting what isn't mine, she said. I'm describing what once was. He stepped closer, thumb brushing her wrist. What once was is still here, he promised. Don't ruin it by trying to prove you're right about a fear. That sentence lingered. A perfume sprayed into a room she could not ventilate. The next day delivered corroborations that were not quite proof. An email forwarded without its earlier thread. The sudden privacy of a calendar that had always been shared. A photograph in an industry blog in which Sienna hovered at the far edge of the frame, as if practicing how to be incidental. When Amara asked how a meeting had gone, he gave her outcomes without process, as if process were a commodity he now traded elsewhere. At dinner with Naya, she tried to deploy humor like a scalpel. Apparently, my PhD in pattern recognition is just fatigue. Nia didn't smile. They count on your grace, sis. They weaponize it. If you doubt yourself, who do you become? The person I need to be to make the table steady, Amara said, and felt the fatigue and the truth of it. One evening, she arrived early to the Metropolitan Grand for a site walkthrough. In a side corridor gold with old polish, she found Sienna alone, practicing how to say a donor's name without swallowing the consonants. She stopped when she saw Amara, posture immaculate, guilt not yet visible, but ready. Ms. Brooks, she said, her voice careful and small. Do you need anything? 1,000 possible sentences moved through Amara and chose not to be said. She studied Sienna the way a builder studies a wall, not for blame, but for load. No, she answered finally. I need the truth to stop requiring an apology. Sienna blinked. Her throat worked. She nodded as if she had heard a blessing and fled before it could become a question. When Amara brought the matter to Michael again, she did it with reverence for language, as if the words themselves could be protected from misuse by saying them slowly. Are you in love with her? She asked. Not dramatic, not accusatory, but as one might ask a surgeon. Will I wake from this hole? Michael closed his eyes, briefly, the way a devout man might at the smell of incense. I am in love with what we built, he said at last. I am in love with our life. I am, he searched for a cliff to stop at, grateful for the team that helps me carry it. You are translating gratitude into crime. Gratitude doesn't meet at midnight, she replied, and it doesn't ask me to mistrust my eyes. His smile was almost tender. Your eyes are tired, he said. Rest. That night she did not. She sat at her desk with the city opening and closing outside the window like a living machine. She pulled out old photographs, paint-dusted hands, a kiss half obscured by blueprints, the brownstone's staircase before it remembered how to be beautiful. She placed them beside recent calendars, receipts, the text Patricia had once sent and then stopped sending. She wasn't assembling a case, she was arranging a mirror. When she looked into it, she saw a woman whose intelligence was being asked to dim itself to preserve a fiction too small for her. In the morning, Amara brewed coffee and set a cup at Michael's place, a domestic rite that still felt like love, even when love had learned to be quiet. He entered the kitchen with a phone already lit by other people's urgencies. He kissed her hairline without tasting the question that waited there. Big night, he said. You'll be brilliant. She sipped, studied him the way a city studies its skyline to memorize what is about to change. I will be, she said, and when I am, I won't let you use my brilliance as evidence that nothing is wrong. He looked up, surprised, almost charmed. There's my warrior. No, she answered, setting the cup down with the gentleness of a verdict. There's your mirror. He laughed then. He had become a man who could hear a warning and mistake it for a compliment. He left the room humming, pockets full of folded explanations, leaving behind the faint, medicinal scent of a lie that believed it was care. Gaslight is a choreography designed to teach you to mistrust your own feet. Amara stood in the kitchen until her balance returned. She touched the diamonds at her throat, not for glamour but for memory, carbon that had learned to survive pressure without revising its nature. The morning moved around her, absorbed her, obeyed, and in that obedient light she understood. She would not spend another season dimming her certainty to make room for someone else's story. Illness, when it is genuine, announces itself with heat and ache. This one arrived with manners. It tapped once at the back of Amara's throat on the morning of the gala, left a faint metallic taste, then seated itself politely behind her eyes. By noon she was moving through the penthouse as if the floor had shifted a degree. Not enough to stumble, just enough to reconsider grace. She blamed the weather, the pace, the unending choreography of being seen. At 1 o'clock, Michael called from a car that moved through Midtown like a decree. You sound rough, he said, gentle, solicitous. Stay home tonight. Please, I'll cover the remarks. You need rest. A kindness, perfectly timed. He always knew where to place the cushion. She washed her face in cool water and told herself the fog would lift. The mirror offered back an image that could pass, eyes a little moonlit, cheekbones holding their ground. She tightened the belt of her robe and opened her laptop to finalize the donor notes. The inbox, always a stage, had already rearranged its props. From Joyce, the event director, a message with the subject line, "Quick program tweak, feel better. So sorry you're under the weather. We've prepped a contingency. If you can't make it, we'll have Ms. Blake introduce Michael for the Founders Dance and read your scholarship announcement. I've already looped PR to adjust the run of show. Rest easy, we've got you covered." Covered. The word placed a hand on her shoulder that was not meant to comfort. Attached, a revised seating chart. Her name softened to gray, unassigned. In its place at the head table, tasteful italics, Sienna Blake, Davenport Estates. Lower on the page, a caption, In Amara Brooks's absence, remarks will be delivered by Ms. Blake on behalf of the foundation. She scrolled with steady fingers. The floral specifications she'd chosen, white anemones for the students who had lost parents in the pandemic, had been replaced by pale roses and winter hydrangea, a safer palette, a blander memory. The quartet's program had shifted too. Out went the piece by the young black composer she'd championed. In came a familiar waltz more suited to photographs than listening. Another email from PR confirming talking points for Sienna's intro. The next chapter, fresh energy, Davenport legacy. We'll position it as a warm handoff. Handoff. As if she held an object she had forgotten to release. She closed the laptop and sat very still, listening to the room the way one listens to a house before a storm. Somewhere in the apartment, the heat clicked alive in the baseboards. A siren confessed itself and moved away. She stood and crossed to the wardrobe where, behind silks and velvet, the gown she had chosen weeks ago waited. A deep, quiet blue that gathered light instead of catching it. Her hand did not touch the hanger. Not yet. Her phone chimed again. Nia, come here. I brought broth and the off-brand gossip only sisters deserve. Amara typed. Not tonight. I'm contagious. Nia's reply arrived before the bubble finished pulsing. I know a different kind of contagion when I hear it. Call if you want me to say the thing you're not ready to say. The thing hovered in the room, calm as furniture. It had been building itself for weeks. Out of whispers, out of receipts folded too small, out of an assistant's placement in photographs that pretended to be candid. Now it tried on the language of inevitability and admired itself. She poured water, took 2 aspirin, and opened the door to the guest room they still called an office when donors visited. On the bulletin board, pinned with brass tacks, were index cards for tonight's program. Scholarships, honorees, the youth orchestra's surprise. Her handwriting, once a choreography. A fresh card clipped over the founder's dance cue in someone else's tidy script. Michael Davenport plus S. Blake, if needed. If needed. She almost laughed. Illness can be merciful when it insists on bed. This one negotiated. At 4, she lay down because lying down resembled surrender, and she wanted to know what surrender felt like before she refused it. She drifted for a moment, not into sleep but into a corridor of memory. The brownstone and its stubborn stairs. Michael with dust in his lashes. The way his optimism used to arrive without an audience. When she opened her eyes, the light had shifted just enough to make evening inevitable. Her phone buzzed once more. Patricia Lively. I'm hearing they're rehearsing a new introduction. Thought you should hear it from a friend and not a caption tomorrow. Another message, a beat later. If I'm wrong, I'll owe you the most expensive apology in Manhattan. If I'm right, wear something they'll have to learn how to describe. Amara smiled, not at the intrigue, but at the relief of being seen by someone who made a profession of looking. She rose and moved through the apartment, collecting the small confirmations a woman gathers when she means to return what was taken. The gown that deepened when deprived of light. The diamonds whose brightness had learned restraint. The clutch with a single card inside. Her own remarks, in her own voice, unlendable. On the kitchen island, the aspirin bottle reconsidered its usefulness. She ignored it. In the closet, she reached past dresses beloved by cameras and chose the one that felt like an argument made entirely of grace. The fabric fell across her palm with the weight of a decision. She laid it on the bed and went to draw a bath. Water steadied her. Steam gentled the ache behind her eyes. She washed the day from her skin as if rinsing residue from a story that had brushed against her without permission. Standing wrapped in a towel in the doorframe, she looked back at the bed, the gown, the necklace, the small velvet box that still held her grandmother's advice. Shine is what remains when the noise goes home. She dressed slowly, like a liturgy. She fastened the clasp at her nape and felt the diamonds settle, not as decoration, but as memory made visible. She slid her feet into shoes that asked her to remember the particular discipline of moving without haste. At the vanity, she kept the makeup simple, evidence of rest where there had been none. In the foyer, she paused by the framed photograph of them, ringing the bell the day the company went public. 2 people, the city bright behind them, a bell between their hands. She touched the glass. We built this, she said quietly, to the photo, to the room, to the woman in the mirror, and then turned away. The elevator hummed its neutral hymn down to the lobby. Roberto, the doorman with a memory for the small things that make love easier, looked up and startled into pleasure. "Ms. Brooks," he said, opening the door to a night clarified by cold. "We heard you weren't feeling well." "I was," she answered, and then I remembered the difference between unwell and uninvited. The driver held the rear door. She shook her head and slid into the front, wanting the dashboard's pragmatic light, the map's truth-telling. As they pulled into traffic, the city presented its glitter, window after window of other people's lives arranged for view. She had loved this theater once, the way Manhattan pretended to be a mirror. Tonight, it felt like a stage on which she would interrupt a play that had mistaken itself for history. At a red light, her phone lit with Michael's name. She let it go to voicemail. The message arrived moments later, tender and precise. "Love, please rest. It won't be the same without you, but it will be fine. I'll send you a picture of the scholarship winners. They'll be thrilled." Fine, a word that smoothed what it could not repair. As the car turned onto Fifth, she closed her eyes and rehearsed the order of her breath, the cadence of her steps, the give of the ballroom doors beneath her hand. She did not plan words. Words would come. She planned composure, the geometry of it, the way it makes a room remember its true dimensions. The Metropolitan Grand appeared ahead, pink granite softening into evening, lamps burning at intervals like the punctuation of an old novel. Guests were already ascending the steps, shoulders tucked into fur and velvet, heads bent toward kisses staged to be seen. Amara felt the small, welcome spike of adrenaline that arrives before one does a thing one has trained for and never rehearsed. At the curb, the car stilled. She waited a full breath before opening the door, not to make anyone wait, but to measure the end of one script and the start of another. Her hand found the handle. The air reached for her, winter sharp and honest. Inside, under chandeliers designed to flatter and forgive, an orchestra tuned itself to consensus. Someone adjusted a microphone to Sienna's height. A stage manager made a note. Substitute remarks. Confirmed. A photographer lifted his camera toward the doors, not knowing why. The illness had not vanished. It had simply been called by its other name, removal. And removal, when recognized, becomes invitation. To enter, to stand, to reorder a room with nothing but the refusal to disappear. Amara stepped out of the car and into the evening that would, by morning, belong to her version of it. The mirror did not ask questions. It received Amara quietly, as it always had, reflecting a woman who had spent years learning how to build structure where there had been none. But tonight, the mirror returned something else. Not simply a face, but the beginning of a storm dressed in silk. She stood in her dressing room, the overhead light lowered to its softest glow, letting the evening unfold in silence before she claimed it. The gown she had chosen earlier now rested against her body like a second skin, midnight black with a liquid finish that absorbed rather than reflected light. The neckline was clean, severe in its simplicity, the fabric sculpted around her waist with an elegance that neither begged nor apologized. It was not a dress for decoration. It was a declaration. Her fingers moved to the diamond necklace resting at her collarbone. The stones were cold at first, always cold, always remembering pressure before they remembered brilliance. They had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had built a small catering empire when the city hadn't thought to ask what black women were capable of. "Diamonds don't shine because they're gentle," her grandmother had said once, adjusting the clasp behind her neck. "They shine because they survived everything that tried to bury them." In the quiet, Amara smoothed her hair back, securing a single diamond pin at the curve of her bun. Her lips wore only a whisper of red, the kind that did not plead for attention, but took it as a matter of fact. Her hands, steady and deliberate, fastened her earrings, then slid into satin gloves that climbed almost to her elbows. The gloves were black too, the shade of a woman who had decided not to compete with light, but command it. She exhaled slowly, watching her own breath fog against the mirror for half a heartbeat. That soft cloud too passed. Behind her, the apartment lay in its usual immaculate order, but something had shifted in the air. It was a kind of stillness that arrives before movement, a tightening of invisible strings. She walked through the rooms with quiet precision, each step clicking against marble, each echo layering over the last like a rehearsal. Near the door hung a framed photograph from their earliest days, Michael laughing, arm around her shoulders, both of them wearing sawdust and sweat like a shared crown. For years, that image had been proof. Now it was simply history, beautiful, untouchable, no longer binding. She paused to slip on her heels. 4 inches, smooth black leather, sculpted. Not a costume, not armor, something in between. She straightened and allowed herself to feel the weight of the evening. Not dread, not fury, but clarity. Clarity had its own gravity. It steadied the breath, lengthened the spine, sharpened the senses. In the foyer, a shawl waited on the coat stand. She ignored it. Tonight she needed no soft edges. The elevator ride was a brief descent through quiet, the kind that collects around steel. As the doors closed, she caught a last sliver of her reflection, poised, still, intentional. Not the woman who had stayed home ill. Not the woman they had rehearsed away from the stage. The doors opened into the lobby, warm light pooling against polished stone. Roberto looked up from the reception desk and froze. Not in surprise, but in the way people freeze when something enters a room and changes its temperature. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his accent wrapping her name with affection and respect. "You're—" He stopped, not finding the word. "You look extraordinary." She smiled softly, the way a queen smiles when a subject names the obvious. "Thank you, Roberto." Good evening. Outside the city was a map of light. Yellow cabs cut through the dark like molten metal. The air carried that winter edge sharp enough to keep secrets alert. She slid into the back seat of the car, its leather cool beneath her palms, and looked through the window as Manhattan drifted past. Every building, every streetlight, every billboard that once served as a backdrop to her marriage now seemed to belong to a different script entirely. She remembered the emails, the seating chart, the revised talking points, the quiet removal of her name from a moment she had created. They thought they were setting a stage. In truth, they were drawing a map for her return. As the car approached the Metropolitan Grand, the hotel rose like an old monarch in blush pink stone and gold trim. On gala nights, its facade shimmered faintly in the glow of chandeliers hidden just beyond its tall glass doors. The driver pulled up to the carpeted entrance, where valets in black gloves opened doors with the brisk efficiency of men who understood they were not part of the story, merely the hinge that allowed it to swing. Amara didn't reach for the handle immediately. She let the engine idle, let the pulse of the place find its rhythm. She thought of the gala last year, how she and Michael had entered side by side, fingers intertwined. He had called her his partner in everything, in front of 500 people in a city that loved to crown its golden couples. And she had believed it. Not naively, earnestly. But belief is a fragile currency. Tonight she was paying with something harder. She stepped out of the car, her heels striking the pavement with a subtle finality that no one could hear but everyone could feel. Valets straightened unconsciously. A passing couple paused, their whispers arrested midair. The fabric of her gown gathered around her like a tide that had decided to move in only one direction. Inside, the hotel lobby glimmered under its chandelier canopy. Crystal pendants scattered light over polished floors, casting reflections that shimmered like fragments of old promises. She walked through them without looking down. People turned, first casually, then deliberately. Some recognized her immediately. Others needed a moment to remember what power looked like when it stopped pretending to be polite. She reached the ballroom doors, where the first notes of the orchestra bled softly into the hallway. A waltz, safe, polished, pleasant. She placed one gloved hand on the door's cool brass handle. It wasn't trembling. It hadn't trembled in a long time. For an instant, a single breath's worth of quiet, she let herself remember the woman she'd been at the first gala. The one who believed the night was a celebration of love and legacy. She bowed her head to her own memory, not with regret, but with gratitude. That woman had built this stage. She had earned the right to reclaim it. The doorman swung the door open before she needed to push. And just like that, the noise of the ballroom spilled into the hallway. A current of champagne laughter, polished applause, orchestral swells, and whispers smooth as silk. But beneath it all was a faint, sharp undertone: expectation. The night had been carefully arranged for a performance. They did not know she was about to rewrite the script. The moment she stepped over the threshold, the air in the room shifted, barely, but unmistakably. Heads began to turn, first one by one, then in clusters, then all at once, as if drawn by some gravitational pull they couldn't name, but could feel in their bones. Amara did not rush. She walked, slowly, deliberately. Every inch of her posture declared not confrontation, but return. Cameras angled themselves before their owners realized why. Crystal glasses paused midair. And somewhere, on the dance floor, Michael Davenport, hands perfectly placed at Sienna Blake's waist, turned at last. She had no words yet. She didn't need any. The room understood something had just changed, though no one could articulate it. The woman they thought had been written out of the story had simply been off stage. And now, she was walking back into the light on her own terms. The ballroom did not go quiet all at once. Silence gathered the way fog does. First a veil over the violins, then a hush that softened conversation, then the clean, unarguable stillness of a room that has recognized a center. Amara crossed the threshold in the music, obedient to something older than tempo, faltered by a heartbeat, and recovered as if embarrassed by its own surprise. She did descend like thunder. She arrived like a line drawn perfectly straight. The floor opened for her without being asked. People parted not out of fear, but out of a respect their bodies discovered before their minds did. She passed couples with smiles, halted midway, the pearls and cufflinks of 100 small ambitions reflecting her back at herself in fragments. The chandeliers scattered their glamour across her gown, and the gown refused to translate. At the center of the room, Michael Davenport turned. His hand hovered at Sienna Blake's waist, the shape of possession without the courage to claim it. For a moment, one human, unguarded second, astonishment emptied his face of performance and left the boy she once knew blinking in the light. Then the boy assembled himself into the man. Calculation returned, like a well-tailored coat. Amara did not look at Sienna first. She looked at Michael as if they were alone on a quiet street and the future had asked for directions. She stopped an arm's length away, close enough to make intimacy plausible, far enough to make dignity incontrovertible. Someone in the balcony adjusted a camera lens. The clicking ceased as the room remembered it might be witnessing a sacrament, not a spectacle. "Good evening," she said, the words even and luminous. They arrived without ornament and did their work. A murmur traveled the room and then sat down, hands folded. Michael found a smile the way a man finds a handrail in the dark. "Amara," he breathed, grateful to say her name as if proof of some decency. This is a surprise. You sounded unwell." "I was," she answered, and in her voice was a kind of weather that meant to clear. And then I remembered I have impeccable timing. Sienna's hands tightened on the silk at her hips. She was very beautiful in the way surprise often is, unguarded, almost tender. Her mouth formed the beginning of a greeting and then forgot how to finish it. The conductor lowered his baton. Air took the music's place. Glasses found tabletops without ringing. "Walk with me," Michael said quickly, a stage whisper designed for microphones. "We'll step out. 2 minutes. No one needs..." He gestured vaguely, as if language were a curtain he might draw. "Out?" Amara repeated, the softest echo. "Everything important is already in." For a long breath, they merely held one another's gaze. An entire history shook itself out and lay between them. Blueprints and late rent paid in faith. Rooms built to the exact measure of a hand pressed against a wall. Mornings where coffee meant covenant. The weight of that history did not plead. It informed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael tried, turning toward the crowd with a host's instinct, the smile widening toward script. "My wife, our guests," Amara said, the pronoun corrected without heat. She did not raise her voice. She trusted the room to come closer. It did. "I won't delay your evening. I came to collect what belongs to me, my presence." A few people exhaled audibly, a sound like belief returning. Patricia Lively lowered her camera, not to spare the moment, but to enlarge it. Amara turned at last to Sienna. Not cruelly, not with triumph, but with the deliberate kindness one offers a person who has wandered, barefoot, into a room full of broken glass. "Ms. Blake," she said, and the honorific was an umbrella when rain is inevitable. "You are out of your depth. That is not a sin, it is a location." Sienna flushed, pink rising under flawless makeup, the body's honest punctuation. "Ms. Brooks, Her voice was young and brave and unprepared. "I'm only here to help the foundation." "I believe you," Amara said, and the terrible mercy of the sentence made Sienna's eyes shine. "Truly. But be careful who asks you to rename the part you're playing. Help is not a synonym for air." Michael's breath sharpened. "This is neither the time nor the place," he managed, the phrase old enough to limp. "You're making this into a moment?" Amara offered, saving him from the word he feared. "It already is one. I prefer to meet moments standing up." He stepped closer, lowering his voice in the old, practiced intimacy. "You're tired. Please." His hand lifted, almost tender, as if to touch her elbow and guide her away from the edge of a cliff he had built. Amara did not move. The hand completed its indecisive arc and dropped, unspent. "If you are going to rewrite our life," she said, her tone still level, "do it somewhere the acoustics aren't so perfect." A small, involuntary laugh trembled through the room. It wasn't mockery. It was relief, the body recognizing truth when it hears it and needing to release pressure. From the dais, a stage manager gestured helplessly toward the program, where a line now read, "Founders Dance, Michael Davenport and Sienna Blake, if needed." The words, "if needed," hovered over the evening like a moth with a secret. "Michael," Amara continued, pivoting her shoulders an inch, an angle that changed the geometry of power without appearing to. "When you asked me to build with you, I brought my mind, my name, my labor. When you asked me to love you, I brought my life. I have never misheard a request. Don't ask me now to misname what this is." "This?" His smile strained. "A dance? An introduction? You're reading malice where there's nothing but logistics." "Logistics do not wear perfume at midnight," she said, "and they don't stand where wives stand while photographs learn new captions." Sienna's eyelashes fluttered once, a small surrender. Michael drew a breath and found, to his own surprise, that no version of charm volunteered. The orchestra, unsure whether to resume, lifted bows experimentally. The violins hummed a single note, pure and tentative, like a throat clearing before a vow. Amara glanced toward them and inclined her head, a benediction or a stay. The bows lowered again. "Whatever you think this is," Michael began, and the sentence already knew it could not persuade her. "Whatever you've been told." "I wasn't told," she said, and a softness entered her voice, the softness of an unassailable fact. "I observed. I believed my eyes. I honored my mind. And now I will honor my name." There was no rage in it, only the calm of a woman who has finished arguing with the weather. She looked one last time at Sienna, whose beauty had become, in this light, indistinguishable from youth. "When someone asks you to keep their secret," Amara said gently, "make sure it's not your future they're asking you to hide." A murmur rose, something between awe and education. The chandelier crystals glittered as if the room had learned a new language for light. Michael pressed his lips together, heroism no longer on offer. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and the question contained too many years. Amara considered him. In that beat, she remembered the first door they hung, the first key that turned, the first morning the house kept the rain out. She let the memory bless what it could and release what it couldn't. "Tell the truth," she said at last, "or tell nothing. But stop asking the world to hold its breath while you decide which you prefer." She stepped back, not retreat, but removal from an argument that had mistaken proximity for power. The space between them clarified like glass after steam. Then, without flourish, she turned, not to leave, not yet, but to face the room that had been made to witness her disappearance. She lifted her chin, and the muscles of the evening rearranged around her choice. The stage manager put a hand to his headset. The conductor touched his baton to his music stand, as one might place a finger on a page to save the line. The story, which had until now behaved as if it belonged to him, felt the axis shift. In the far corner, a door to the terrace stood ajar. Winter air edged in, honest and cold. Somewhere in that draft was the next thing, the speech, the reckoning, the redefinition of a dance that had forgotten its founders. Amara let the silence mature one heartbeat longer, a vintner listening for the exact second the note turns. When she spoke again, she did not address Michael. She addressed the night. A room can become a witness when it has seen enough. The Metropolitan Grand, which had spent a century flattering the people inside it, now listened with the stillness of a court awaiting testimony. Amara faced the crowd as if the chandeliered ceiling were the open sky, and she meant every word to travel. "Good evening," she began again, and even the crystal seemed to lean toward her. "I won't keep you long. You came to celebrate scholarships, not spectacle. But the work we claim to do in the city begins with the truth we practice in rooms like this. A stir, not of discomfort, but of recognition. People set their glasses down because the hands holding them wanted to be empty." She inclined her head to the orchestra. "Maestro, may I borrow a measure?" The conductor lowered his baton. Sound retreated. Silence took its rightful shape. Amara's voice softened into the kind of clarity that does not ask permission to be believed. "You know us as founders. The press calls us a power couple. But before any of that, there was a house with windows boarded from the inside and a heart that insisted on opening. We built from there. Brick and ledger, dream and discipline." She let the past stand beside her, whole and unarguable, then turned gently toward the present. "Somewhere along the way, we learned a dangerous habit, confusing appearance for integrity. Calling logistics what is really longing, naming convenience destiny, and when a woman notices the math does not add up, we call her tired, or unwell, or unkind for pointing at the missing number." No one moved. The sentence crossed the parquet and settled, a verdict resting its case. Across from her, Michael stood with the practiced composure of a man who had rehearsed every emergency but this one. Sienna held herself very still, as if motion might blur her into safety. Amara did not brandish their names. She had no need. The room already knew the nouns. "To our donors," she continued, "who wrote checks because you believed we were building not merely buildings but futures, hear me. The Foundation's mission is sound. The programs are real. Our students are not props threaded through other people's stories. They are the story." She glanced toward a table where 3 scholarship recipients sat, faces luminous and stricken. "If you must doubt something tonight, doubt our choreography, not their worth." At the edge of the dance floor, Patricia Lively lowered her camera again, not to spare anyone, but to keep from fixing the moment too soon. Even she, an archivist of glitter, understood that some scenes must be allowed to breathe before they are framed. Amara's attention returned to Michael with the deliberate grace of a compass finding north. "We built an empire, you and I," she said, not pleading, not accusing, accounting. "But the architecture of a life cannot depend on a face turned toward a lens. Not mine, not yours. When the frame becomes more important than the foundation, walls will call the wind a scandal to excuse their collapse." A ripple of rueful laughter, thin, grateful, moved through the crowd. The chandeliers answered with a small shiver of light. She turned slightly, including Sienna without summoning her shame. "And to the young who are drafted into the pageants of the powerful, be certain the role you're offered has a name you would still want when the lights go home. Help is honorable. Inheritance is not something one is handed in secret." Amara stepped once into the space where music had been, occupying it with her breath. "It would be tidy to call this a misunderstanding," she went on. "It would be profitable to call it a narrative pivot." Her smile was almost kind. "I will call it what it is. An attempt to edit a wife into a rumor so a rumor may be edited into a wife." The word. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no counter-argument that would not curdle upon contact with air. His hand lifted, palm outward, as if to bless the room, or stop it, and then fell, empty. Amara let the mercy in her rise to the surface. "I do not require an apology," she said. "I require accuracy. Tonight's dance was founded by 2 people. One is here. The other is also here." A few in the crowd exhaled audibly. grateful to be given language that did not ask them to choose blindness. She turned toward the dais. The agenda stands. The scholarships will be awarded. The musicians will play. And tomorrow the foundation will publish a statement reaffirming our work. Its governance, its transparency, its future. That future does not depend on captions under photographs. It depends on promises kept in rooms where cameras are not invited. The stage manager, who had been clutching a clipboard like a shield, released a breath that fogged his glasses. He tilted his headset mic away from his mouth and wiped it with the cuff of his sleeve, as if clearing the frequency for something finer. "Before we continue," Amara said, "a request." She faced the conductor. "Maestro, could your strings give us 8 bars of something that remembers how truth feels? Barber's Adagio, perhaps, just the beginning." The conductor, grateful for instruction that sounded like respect, nodded. Bows lifted. The first notes entered the room like honesty. Unadorned, unhurried, unable to be mistaken. Over that slender music, Amara spoke once more, not to the crowd, but through it. "When we say legacy, let us mean what outlives us because it nourishes others, not what flatters us because it bears our names. When we say partner, let us mean the person who stands in the light with us and in the accounting with us, not the one we cast into shadow so the angle suits our cheekbones." A young waiter in the corner, who had once thought wealth made people taller, found his posture corrected without knowing why. A trustee who had quietly loved Amara's work more than the dinners that celebrated it straightened, chastened, and relieved. A student at the back wiped his eyes with the cuff of a borrowed jacket and decided to keep the letter he'd written her in his inside pocket for luck, rather than courage. He would not need courage for this anymore. The Adagio hovered on its last sustain. Silence opened its hands to receive it. Amara inclined her head to the musicians. "Thank you," she said, and the gratitude sounded like the beginning of a different era. Then she faced Michael one final time, placing a single sentence where explanations had sought to multiply. "This is not a scene," she told him quietly. "It is a standard." He swallowed, understanding, too late, that standards cannot be negotiated in public once they have been neglected in private. He nodded, a small, stunned bow to the inevitable. Amara stepped back from the center, returning the floor to its intended business without surrendering an inch of the authority she had claimed. "Please," she said to the room, her palms opening in a secular benediction. "Eat, applaud, give. Our students are waiting on our better selves." The conductor lifted his baton. The quartet changed keys, something lighter this time, a graceful pivot that did not erase what had been said, but allowed breath to return to the lungs that had been holding it. Conversations resumed in lower tones, vowels softened by thought. The ballroom, having learned what it was for, began again, and Amara, having finished the work that only she could do, turned her face toward the corridor leading to the terrace and the clean winter air beyond, ready to leave without hurry, the way a judge leaves the bench when the matter has been decided. The first step away from the center felt like the release of a held note. Amara turned from the room she had steadied and allowed the music to resume, not behind her but around her, like water closing gently over a swimmer who knows her stroke. Conversation returned in softened consonants. Silverware reconsidered its purpose. Somewhere a laugh tried to be born and, finding itself premature, became a sigh. She crossed the parquet without haste, the hem of her gown persuading the floor to remember every dancer who had ever declared a threshold. People moved aside with an instinct that had nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with respect. A young server, hands trembling above a tray of coupes, adjusted his grip. Amara touched the rim of a single glass with the tip of her glove, a silent benediction for steadiness, and the tray stopped shaking. At the edge of her vision, Michael remained where she had left him, a man surrounded by witnesses and suddenly unaccompanied by narrative. He looked smaller, not in stature but in premise, like a blueprint held up to sunlight until the ink faded. Sienna, to her credit, did not cling to him. She moved a half-pace back and folded her hands as if acknowledging a chapel. Patricia Lively stepped into Amara's path and then, unexpectedly, stepped aside. "You don't need me to frame this," she murmured, camera lowered, the rare humility in her tone like an old jewel-worn plane. It framed itself. Amara met her eyes and nodded, a smile passing across her mouth like good weather over a responsible city. "Then let it breathe," she said, and went on. Near the scholarship table, a boy in a borrowed jacket stood so straight he looked as if he might splinter. His acceptance letter bulged in the inside pocket. When Amara approached, he pressed his lips together, terrified of saying the wrong thing to the person whose name had turned his year from hallway into door. She spared him the search for language. "Enjoy dessert," she said softly. "Let yourself believe this is the beginning, because it is." He nodded too hard, eyes shining, and she left him with the relief of a permission he hadn't known he needed. The ballroom doors were half open, a gasp held in wood and brass. As she neared them, the quartet shifted to something bright, almost festive, and the room, eager to be told it could survive the truth, obliged. Amara did not judge it. Celebration is one way to keep from breaking. In the corridor, the air cooled by 10 degrees and told fewer lies. The carpet remembered footsteps with dignity rather than gossip. She paused at a gilded mirror that had been hung to flatter and found, instead, accuracy. A woman whose beauty was no longer an argument for anything but itself. She adjusted a glove. The diamond at her throat flashed once, then returned to its discipline. "Miss Brooks?" The voice belonged to Joyce, the event director, cheeks flushed, head set askew. The apology had already begun to gather in her face. About the changes, PR pressed, and Mr. Davenport." "It's done," Amara said, not unkindly. "Pick up the cues and let the students take the light. If anyone asks for direction, tell them to read the mission. It has not changed." Joyce nodded, relief and mortification crossing her features like weather in a harbor. "Yes, ma'am." She took one step, then turned back. "You were—" She seemed to search for a word that could survive tomorrow. "Correct." "Good," Amara said. "Now be generous." The terrace welcomed her with honest winter. The city opened itself, glittering with the effort of being everyone's story at once. She moved to the marble balustrade and placed both gloved hands upon the cold stone, grounding herself in something that would never be invited to any gala and would outlast them all. Breath lifted from her in white ribbons that unspooled and vanished. Behind the glass, lives continued. Toasts raised, signatures promised, glances exchanged that would either become legend or lesson. Out here, the night made no such guarantees. The wind found the edge of her hairline and tested it, affectionate as a sister. For the first time all evening, Amara closed her eyes. Not in fatigue. Fatigue had no jurisdiction now, but in a kind of prayer that did not require language. She counted the things she knew. That the foundation would be fine if she insisted. That the company would not be fine if she left. That her leaving had already begun in the disciplined place behind her ribs, where a door had swung inward to admit a truth and then locked from the other side. When she opened her eyes, the city had rotated a degree. She turned back toward the doors. Nia stood just inside, coat over her arm, eyes wet with a pride that refused the word pity. "You didn't call," she said, mouth tilted, voice steady. "I didn't need to," Amara replied. Nia stepped near enough to touch but did not, honoring the posture that had carried her sister across the room. "You were precise," she said. "You were merciful where some people would have chosen theater." "Theater is for stories that end inside their own walls," Amara answered. "This doesn't." Nia's gaze flicked toward the ballroom's interior. "He's unraveling but trying to arrange it into a scarf. You know he will ask to talk. Tonight. Tomorrow. In the language you taught him." "I know," Amara breathed, felt the air enter clean and leave cleaner. "I will listen. Then I will ask for half of what I built and the whole of my time." Nia smiled with her teeth and with the line between her brows that meant history had been respected. "I brought the car," she said, "in case you didn't want to wait at the curb." "I will walk through the lobby," Amara said, as if choosing a route through her own life. "This house should remember my back as well as my face." They turned together. Before re-entering, Amara glanced once more at the room beyond the glass. Across the parquet, Michael had finally begun to move. Not toward her, not yet, but toward the nearest version of consequence. A cluster of trustees who had learned to speak in numbers because numbers leave fewer fingerprints. Sienna sat in a chair with her hands folded, the picture of decorum and the shape of a lesson. The corridor received the sisters without remark. Along the wall, portraits observed, catching in oil the borrowed gentility of people who had once congratulated themselves with frames. Amara and Nia crossed the lobby where the chandelier cast coins of light on polished stone. Conversations paused, then continued at a respectful volume, as if the room had been told the rules again and was grateful. At the front desk, Roberto straightened as if for inspection. "A car is waiting, Miss Brooks," he said. "Will you need—" "Only the door," she replied, and he, a man who considered every hinge a stage, granted her the perfect proscenium of an open night. Outside, the evening held its temperature, not warmer for her courage, not colder for the error she had corrected. The driver hurried around, but Naya beat him to the handle and opened it with the proprietary tenderness of family. Amara paused with one heel already inside and looked back, up the steps, through the doors, into the ballroom where the city. She did not lift her hand. Farewell was too theatrical for truth. She sat, the gown accommodating the car as effortlessly as water does a stone. Nia rounded to the other door, slid in, and gave the driver an address that was not the penthouse. The car eased from the curb without a jolt, as if it too respected the sentence that had just been spoken by a woman who did not raise her voice. As they turned onto Fifth, the hotel receded to a portrait size in the rear window. Amara watched it transform from place to symbol to ornament, and finally to air. She let her head rest against the leather, not in defeat, but in transfer, of weight, of allegiance, of the center of gravity from an old. Nia's hand found hers on the seat between them. They did not squeeze. They were not girls on a roller coaster. They were women in a city that had been informed. "Home?" Nia asked. "For now," Amara said, and the two words contained more future than any oath either of them had ever made. The lights along the park stitched themselves into a soft seam. A skater spun once on the distant rink, a bright pinhead turning, brave and small and unstoppable. In the quiet that followed, the night admitted what she already knew. The walkout was not an ending, but the cleanest beginning a life can ask for. The kind that leaves the door open behind you, because you have finally remembered which side of it is yours. Power does not always announce its arrival with thunder. Sometimes it enters a room after you've already left it, sits down quietly in your chair, and waits for everyone else to notice. In the days following the gala, Amara Brooks didn't fight for control of anything. She simply stopped holding what no longer belonged to her, and the world, unprepared for that kind of precision, began to rearrange itself around her absence. Her walkout had not been theatrical. It had been deliberate, measured, architectural. The kind of act that leaves walls standing, but removes the beams that once held them steady. The board of the Davenport Foundation woke the next morning to inboxes swollen with headlines. The founder who refused to vanish. Donors called, not to withdraw, but to ask her what happened. Trustees, once fluent in Michael's easy charm, found themselves speaking a language that no longer worked without her name. In her penthouse overlooking the park, a place that had once felt like a shared crown and now felt like antechambers to something larger, Amara sat at the long oak table she'd picked for strategy sessions. Morning sunlight cut across its surface like a ruler. Before her lay a stack of envelopes, personal, handwritten, the kind that people only send when they believe what they've seen. On top sat Patricia Lively's front page spread, Amara at the ballroom doors, posture like a gavel. Not a woman in scandal, the headline implied, but a woman in sentence. The phone on the table buzzed once. She didn't need to look. It was Michael, for the third time that morning. Her assistant, Lena, hovered at the doorway like someone entering a cathedral. "Do you want me to answer?" "No," Amara said softly, tracing a fingertip over the rim of her coffee cup. "I want him to learn how silence sounds." The foundation had already requested an emergency board meeting, but it wasn't Michael who called it. It was Harold Chen, their lead trustee, a man who had spent the last decade trying to replicate Amara's clarity in spreadsheets. The meeting would be held in the conference suite on Madison, the same one where Amara had once negotiated the first seven-figure endowment. The irony didn't trouble her. It felt inevitable. She arrived in a dark, sharply tailored suit that made no room for sentimentality. Her hair, swept into a smooth knot, revealed the calmness in her posture. She wore no diamonds tonight. Power, properly worn, doesn't always need to sparkle. Inside, the long mahogany table gleamed with a faint, nervous shine. 12 faces turned to her as she entered, not with pity, not with shock, but with the kind of attentive gravity reserved for the person who now, undeniably, held the room. Amara, Harold greeted, standing. Thank you for coming. She gave him a small nod, then surveyed the others, the legal counsel, the treasurer, the heads of donor relations. Finally, Michael, sitting 2 seats from the end, shoulders pressed into the back of the chair like someone bracing against a tide. Sienna was not there. Of course she wasn't. This wasn't her war. Harold, laughter fluttered weakly at the edges of the table. Amara didn't offer them an escape. He continued, we've received calls from 6 of our major donors. 5 of them want reassurance. One of them, Carnegie Trust, explicitly asked to deal directly with you, Amara. They made it clear that their partnership was with you, not Davenport Estates. Her gaze flicked to Michael, then returned to Harold. I see. Michael leaned forward. We can address this together. It's a misunderstanding that's already cooling. A statement. Michael, Harold interrupted gently, like a man correcting a child who hadn't realized the lesson was already written on the board. I think you misunderstand where we are. The narrative isn't cooling. It's crystallizing. The silence after was almost kind. Amara folded her hands on the table, not as a gesture of supplication, but as the steady placement of a cornerstone. The foundation has always been more than a surname. It was built on a mission, and that mission was safeguarded by reputation, by trust. That trust doesn't live in the walls. It lives in people. And that Michael shifted but said nothing. The trustees have discussed, Harold went on, an interim leadership restructuring. We believe the cleanest way forward for the foundation and its donors is to remove the ambiguity about who speaks for us. We'd like you to assume full executive leadership. Michael finally spoke. I'm still the founder. No, Amara replied evenly. We are the founders. But you traded your place in that story the night you decided to script me out of it. Harold leaned forward. This isn't personal. It's pragmatic. Donors trust Amara. She built the bridges. If we want the foundation to survive this news cycle, let alone the next fiscal year, we need her at the helm. The vote was ceremonial. It passed without dissent. Even Michael didn't contest it. He merely sat there, realizing too late that the room he thought he owned had been hers all along. After the meeting, she stepped out into the hallway alone. The night had dropped into Manhattan like a silk curtain, soft but absolute. Down the corridor, Michael caught up to her. His voice was lower now, stripped of the performance he'd carried like armor. Amara, he said. Please, I didn't want this to. You wanted me gone without having to name it, she answered. Her voice wasn't sharp. It didn't need to be. You built a story around yourself and forgot who designed the walls. I made a mistake. She met his eyes, and for a heartbeat, the weight of their history flickered like a light on old film. No, she said. You made a choice. He opened his mouth, searching for something redemptive, something that could rewind what had already been spoken into the world. But power, once released from someone's hands, does not crawl back because it is begged. She walked past him, the sound of her heels an unbroken metronome against marble. Outside, the city's wind pressed against her coat like applause, withheld until the end of a symphony. She tilted her face to the night sky. There was no sense of triumph, only a deep, resonant steadiness, like the shifting of tectonic plates beneath a city that would never know their names, but would always live on the shape they left behind. The foundation had been his mirror. It was now her empire, and she hadn't raised her voice once. Rebirth did not thunder through Amara's life. It opened like a window she had been leaning against for years without realizing it was unlatched. The morning after the vote, she woke before the city's pulse and stood at the glass, watching Central Park darken into that blue that belongs to the hour before certainty. On the dresser, her wedding band lay where she had set it the night before, small as a comma between 2 complete sentences. She did not touch it. She reached instead for her fountain pen. On a single sheet of letterhead, her name alone at the top, unadorned, she wrote the first paragraph of a manifesto she refused to call a manifesto. It began like a vow and ended like a plan. Capital is a language. We will teach it to speak in whole sentences about people who have only ever been mentioned in footnotes. By noon, a name had chosen her. Elysian Ventures. Not a promise of heaven, but a field where the labor of the living could be dignified. She leased a narrow floor in a Soho building that had once been a textile factory and still smelled faintly of cotton when the radiators hissed. The elevator was old enough to prefer patience. The light was excellent. She bought a conference table long enough to host contradiction, hung a black and white photograph of the Harlem brownstone at one end, and a portrait of her grandmother whisking batter at the other, flower lifting like blessing. "Is it mad?" Nia asked, standing in the doorway on moving day. "To love a room this quickly?" "It's not the room," Amara said, opening a window. "It's the air it's teaching me to breathe." They assembled a team not from industry parties but from conversation. A former teacher who could read a business plan like a syllabus. A data analyst who had grown up cataloging the miracles of a corner store. A lawyer who understood how to turn dignity into clauses. They sat on borrowed chairs the first week, eating soup from cartons, writing a thesis for a fund that believed return and repair were not opposing terms. Amara walked the perimeter during calls, voice low, hands open, the old habit of calming rooms by giving them purpose. Her first pitch meeting as an investor rather than supplicant happened on a Tuesday, bright as new porcelain. 3 young women arrived carrying a prototype in a cardboard box rescued from a produce market. Their company, First Light, built an adaptive learning platform for students who had learned to hide their brilliance because the classroom had never been edited for them. The founders were fierce and unpolished, the way truth often is. "What do you need that you don't know how to ask for?" Amara said after they had presented, and the question undid them. They told her about the landlord who raised the rent when they signed their first contract, the developer who offered to polish their UI for equity, the angel who asked if they planned to get married, as a proxy for asking if they planned to get serious. Amara listened with that alert quiet that had once steadied city councils. "Here are my terms," she said at last, sliding a single page across the table. "Capital that behaves. Mentorship that doesn't condescend. Introductions that stick. And protection written down." They blinked like people relearning light. "Why us?" one asked, almost accusing, as if gratitude might cost her leverage. "Because you already built the thing," Amara said, smiling. "I'm just removing what keeps it from being seen." The check cleared on Friday. On Monday, their servers didn't crash under the weight of their first district contract. 2 weeks later, a guidance counselor cried on Zoom. Amara's days braided themselves into a rhythm both new and familiar. Site visits, diligence calls, evenings spent in kitchens that doubled as offices, and offices that finally felt like rooms where work could maintain a soul. She discovered a pleasure she hadn't known she missed, laughter that wasn't performing. At night, she returned to the penthouse less often, and to a Brooklyn brownstone more. The one she bought with sun on the stoop and a maple out front old enough to have memorized 3 generations of summer. The house had wide plank floors and a staircase that sang only a little. In the back room, she set up a writing desk facing a plum tree. The first time she fell asleep there, window cracked, the city sounded like rain remembering how to be mercy. She went once, quietly, to the original Harlem brownstone, their first beloved ruin, now restored and bearing someone else's laughter. From the sidewalk, she looked at the second-floor window where they had once taped a sketch of a future kitchen and argued about where the light should fall. When the current owner stepped out with a bag of recycling, she introduced herself. "We kept the banister," the woman said, as if confessing a faith. "It wobbles if you lean, but it holds." "I know," Amara answered. "It was made to." Letters began to arrive, not just from donors, but from women who had learned to build lives around other people's convenience and were tired. Some were long, careful, typed on office printers after hours. Some were scrawled on the backs of receipts. She read them at her kitchen island, pressing each page flat with her palm as if blessing a restless heart. She did not save all of them. She saved the ones whose sentences taught her something about repair. In March, Patricia Lively appeared in her office with a camera lowered, and an apology Amara did not require. "I want to do a profile," Patricia said, "but not the kind I know how to write. No angles, Just a woman doing a thing that is not a performance. Then don't write a profile, Amara said. Write a ledger, and put my founders' names at the top, not mine. The piece that ran 2 weeks later looked almost plain. It moved like clear water. On a wet Wednesday, Michael waited outside her building, leaning against a black car that tried too hard. He looked like a man with a migraine caused by hindsight. "I'm not here to beg," he said, hands open. "I'm here to acknowledge. You were right. About the foundation. About all of it." She studied him the way you study a neighborhood you no longer live in, with tenderness and relief. "Acknowledgement is a beginning," she said, "not a bridge." He nodded, the gesture heavy with old love that had learned manners. "I'll have my attorney coordinate. You'll have everything you asked for." She inclined her head in thanks and went upstairs without looking back. Mercy, she had learned, is sometimes the refusal to reopen a door. Spring arrived like forgiveness, soft and exact. The maple on her block leafed out with a discipline that felt like instruction. In the mornings, she ran along the promenade and let the river teach her about moving forward without spectacle. In the evenings, she hosted salons that didn't call themselves salons. 8 chairs around the long table, a pot of something that tasted like patience. Founders trading failures as casually as recipes. She instituted a rule. Name a mistake, and the price it saved you later. Laughter came easy then, the generous kind that makes room for courage to sit down. The Elysian office filled with the hum that only arrives when a mission stops needing to introduce itself. First Light hired 8 engineers and built an accessibility feature that made a superintendent cry in a stairwell. An urban hydroponics startup delivered its first order to a school cafeteria and sent a photo of children eating lettuce like a dare. A legal tech founder who had once been a public defender negotiated her own term sheet and framed it, not as a trophy, but as an artifact of fluency. Some nights, alone at the brownstone, Amara took the diamond necklace from its velvet and fastened it over a t-shirt, just to feel the weight of survival while making tea. She wrote notes to her future self in the margins of contracts, small admonitions and blessings. Be precise. Be kind. Last. She kept a file labeled, "Letters to the Girl I Was," and added to it in calm ink, "You are not dramatic. You are accurate." On a Sunday in May, she hosted a garden party in the narrow yard behind the house. String lights, thrifted china, the scent of basil and pragmatism. The founders came with partners and babies, and a noise that sounded like the future rehearsing. Nia toasted with water, as if sobriety were a new kind of joy. Patricia didn't bring her camera. The neighbors leaned over the fence and offered brownies without agenda. As dusk pooled violet in the corners, Amara stepped inside to refill a pitcher and caught her reflection in the kitchen window, the kind of accidental mirror that tells fewer lies. She looked rested, not empty of effort, but rich in it. The woman in the glass lifted the pitcher and smiled, not at herself, but at the life arrayed behind her. Plates drying on a rack, a stack of pitch decks, the first edition of a book of poems she had bought in college and carried through every lease. Outside, someone began an off-key chorus of "Happy Birthday" for a child who wasn't yet sure the song belonged to him. Amara stood in the doorway and added her voice, a low harmony that steadied the pitch, not stealing attention, only giving it a spine. That night, when the last glass was washed and the yard had returned to its ordinary moon, she sat at her desk and wrote one more line on the paper that had become her private constitution. Revenge is a debt paid to the wrong creditor. Build instead. It began, as revolutions often do, with something quiet. A single voice in a crowded room, clear enough to make the noise hesitate. 2 months after the night of the gala, Amara Brooks stood on the stage of the Meridian Forum, a historic auditorium whose floorboards had carried a century of declarations. She wasn't a keynote speaker, not exactly. She was a woman the city had decided to listen to. The event itself was a summit on capital and community, a constellation of donors, innovators, and the usual polished voices of power. But that evening, something felt different. It wasn't the chandeliers or the careful lighting designed to make ambition look golden. It was the way the room leaned toward her before she spoke, as if it already knew it had run out of excuses not to hear. She stepped to the lectern without notes. Her black silk suit fit like a sentence too deliberate to be revised. The audience settled, the murmurs falling away like snow in a courtyard. "When I was 25, she began, I walked into my first investor meeting wearing borrowed heels and a dress I thought would make me invisible in the right way. I spoke softly because I'd been taught that money listened better when women whispered. I believed that if I made myself small enough, the world would let me build something big." Her voice was neither loud nor embellished, but it carried. It had learned to travel through rooms like this, not by force, but by precision. "I was wrong," she continued, her gaze sweeping the front rows. "The world does not reward smallness. It consumes it. It rewards the illusion of power, but it follows the voice that knows what it's worth." There was no applause, at least not yet. This was not a line meant to earn it. It was a line meant to enter the bloodstream. She spoke of Elysian ventures, but not as a victory. She described its origins like a scar that had learned to speak. A foundation built in the shadow of betrayal, but strengthened by the refusal to make betrayal the whole story. She spoke of the founders she funded, the women who had been asked to smile through disrespect, the men who refused to inherit broken blueprints, the immigrants who had learned to build with both hands tied and still drew straight lines. "I am not here," she said, "because my story is extraordinary. I'm here because it's ordinary. Ordinary for women to give away their brilliance to systems that only remember the man standing next to them. Ordinary to mistake endurance for equality. Ordinary to be told they're dramatic when they are merely accurate." A ripple moved through the audience. Not a sound exactly, but the subtle shifting of spines straightening, heads lifting. That was the thing about truth. When spoken without apology, it rearranged posture before it rearranged policy. She walked away from the lectern, allowing the stage to belong to her feet rather than the furniture. "We are done whispering in rooms that should be listening," she said. "We are done making our ambitions smaller so someone else's ego can feel taller." The first round of applause broke like rain against glass, tentative, then growing. But she didn't ride it. She waited. And when it ebbed, she lowered her voice slightly, forcing the microphones and the men in the back to lean in. "Power has spent a long time teaching us to believe that its legitimacy comes from pedigree, from surnames, from old money, from how still the room goes when it enters. But power," she paused, letting the word breathe, "is not inherited. It's claimed, quietly, repeatedly, until no one remembers a time when it wasn't yours." She spoke for 30 minutes. No slides, no bullet points, just a story, layered like a cathedral being built from memory. Every sentence laid down like a brick that expected to outlive applause. By the time she stepped off stage, the room was already bending itself around her voice. Conversations that had once been about deals shifted, subtly, into conversations about change. Outside the auditorium, as people spilled into the marble foyer, a young woman in a slate-gray blazer intercepted her. "Miss Brooks," she said, breathless, "I don't want to bother you, but—" "You're not bothering me," Amara said gently. The girl's name tag read Kendra Okafor, startup fellow, age perhaps 24, the kind of hungry that builds bridges. "I've heard people talk about equity for years," Kendra said, "but it's the first time it didn't sound like a sermon. It sounded like oxygen." Amara smiled, not the triumphant kind, but the kind a builder gives when someone notices the foundation instead of the facade. "Good," she said. "Then breathe." More faces followed. Founders, donors, journalists. Some wanted a quote. Others just wanted to stand close enough to catch the echo. Amara had learned to give neither too much nor too little. Just enough to let the echo belong to them, not her. Later that night, she walked alone down Fifth Avenue, the city flickering around her like a vast, restless constellation. Her heels struck a measured rhythm against the pavement. Above her, towers of glass reflected themselves into the dark like truths waiting to be claimed. Her reflection followed her in the black gloss of the shopfronts, not the reflection of a woman trying to prove herself, but of one who had stopped asking for permission. Her phone buzzed. A message from Harvard Business School. "Confirming your keynote for commencement. Full house expected." A second message from UNESCO. "Requesting your participation in a global entrepreneurship forum." And somewhere further down the list, a third from Patricia Lively, containing only a single line. Your voice has outgrown the ballroom. She paused beneath a lamppost. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and possibility. For years she had spoken in rooms that asked her to perform gratitude for being allowed inside. Tonight, she realized those rooms had grown too small for her. Power had shifted, not with her taking it, but with her becoming it. As she reached the corner, she noticed a small group of women, founders she had mentored, waiting outside a cafe. They spotted her and began waving, half proud, half laughing, their joy uncontained. She crossed the street, their faces illuminated by the warm halo of the street lamp. "Tell us," one said, "what it felt like in there." "Like they finally remembered to listen," Amara replied. And for a moment, as the city wrapped its night around them, she understood something quietly magnificent. This was no longer just her story. Her voice had become an instrument, and others were already learning how to play in the same key. The city had a particular way of holding its breath just before dawn, the kind of stillness that feels almost like mercy. From the terrace of her brownstone, Amara Brooks watched Manhattan stretch itself awake, the skyline muted in its silver skin, the river below dark and thoughtful, a soft breeze slipping between buildings like an old friend. This hour had become hers, before headlines, before meetings, before anyone else's voice tried to find its way into her day. She wrapped her hands around a warm porcelain mug and leaned against the railing, feeling the cool metal press into her palms. It was strange to think of how much could change without a single explosion. The night of the gala had been a fracture, but what followed had not been a war. It had been an unfolding. A slow, exact reordering of everything she had once built to carry someone else's name. The world had grown quiet around her. Not silent, never silent, but quiet in the way a symphony listens to its conductor. Inside, her desk was cluttered with the kind of chaos she loved. Pitch decks annotated in her hand, contracts awaiting her signature, a dog-eared novel opened halfway through a sentence she'd been savoring. On the floor, a pair of running shoes leaned against the wall, their laces soft from daily use. It was a life without choreography, a life she had chosen. The phone on the table buzzed once. Michael's name, again. She had stopped dreading the sound. Now it only meant what it meant, something she no longer needed to hold. She let it ring out, then fade, like the distant rumble of a train that didn't stop at her station anymore. A soft knock came at the door. Naya entered, barefoot, a scarf wrapped around her neck like a careless ribbon. She poured herself coffee without asking, their quiet companionship as practiced as breathing. "You're up early," she said. "I always am," Amara replied. "I like to hear the city before it remembers who it's supposed to be." Naya smiled, folding herself into the chair opposite. "The foundation board meeting is today. Are you nervous?" Amara shook her head slowly. "No, I'm steady. Nervous was when I thought I had to be chosen. Now I just choose." Nia raised her mug in a small toast. To choosing, Amara echoed, and the two women drank like sisters who had learned the cost of silence and the beauty of claiming a name. Later that morning, dressed in a dark fluid suit and a pair of heels that no longer felt like armor, Amara walked the 5 blocks to the foundation headquarters. Reporters lingered outside the glass doors like petals caught in wind, their questions darting and bright. "Will you be expanding Elysian Ventures? Are you stepping down from the foundation entirely? What does this mean for Michael Davenport?" She didn't break stride. She didn't have to. The story they wanted wasn't hers anymore. It was theirs. Something to be consumed, not defined. Her story lived elsewhere now, in the quiet acts of building. Inside, the boardroom looked different, though nothing had changed. The same long table, the same portraits on the wall. But now the air held the weight of someone who no longer asked permission to breathe it. Harold Chen stood as she entered. "Madam Chair," he said, and the words landed cleanly in the room. The agenda was swift. Her proposal for a new governance structure, shared power, transparent leadership, programs designed to outlive individual names, passed without resistance. Even Michael, seated at the far end, nodded with a quiet that wasn't defeat, but acknowledgement. When the vote was over, she signed her name at the bottom of the document with a pen that didn't shake. As she left the building, the wind caught at the hem of her coat like a conspirator. On the sidewalk, a group of young founders she'd funded waited with flowers that still held the dew of the morning. Kendra Okafor, nervous, bright, and blazing, stepped forward with a bouquet wrapped in craft paper. "We just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Not for the funding, for reminding us we can take up space." Amara's hand closed around the stems. "Don't thank me," she said gently. "Just keep taking it." They laughed, the sound like sunlight warming brick. That afternoon, she took the long way home. Through the park where she had once run to escape her own house. Past the old cafe where she had learned to negotiate over lukewarm coffee and cheap croissants. Across the river bridge where the city stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a canvas. Every step stitched a seam in a life she now inhabited fully. By sunset, she stood once again on her terrace. The skyline was bathed in the honey light of late day. The city was loud now, horns and shouts and the restless hum of ambition. But she no longer mistook that noise for power. Real power was this: stillness without permission, joy without apology, a future without someone else's script. She set the bouquet in a vase, the diamond necklace, her grandmother's, the one she had worn on the night everything broke open, rested on the windowsill. She lifted it, feeling its familiar weight, then placed it around her neck. It didn't anchor her. It crowned her. Her phone buzzed one last time, but this time it wasn't Michael. It was an email from Harvard confirming the commencement speech. Beneath it, a note from UNESCO, and another from a startup in Lagos asking if she'd mentor their founders. She smiled. Not the smile of vindication, but of arrival. Amara Brooks had not burned down the house she built. She had simply walked out, taken the blueprints with her, and built something better. Something that could hold more than one story, more than one woman, more than one version of power. She was no longer the whispered name behind a man's legend. She was the echo that turned into a voice, the voice that turned into a chorus, the chorus that would outlive the room that tried to contain it. She lifted her gaze toward the darkening sky and breathed deeply. Choosing herself had never been an act of rebellion. It had always been an act of return. If you've journeyed with Amara to this moment, through betrayal, reclamation, and rebirth, remember this: your story is not over just because someone else tried to write its ending. You are the pen. You are the page. You are the voice that resonates. If her journey spoke to something in you, like, share, and follow. Let's keep telling stories where choosing yourself is not the end. It's the beginning.